You're listening to 91.7 FM, WSUW, in Whitewater, Wisconsin. Let me spin you a tale. Imagine a country so vast, it covers 12 different time zones. A country rich in oil, gas, and timber, yet a country that imports everything else, including gasoline. A country where value of money depends on the price of a barrel of oil. A country ruled by its security agency, where those objecting get sent to prison, shot, and poisoned. A country where TV battles the refrigerator. A country where people can't decide what is worse, to stay silent or to speak up. A country where George Orwell's 1984 is a bestseller. Now imagine you live there. You're listening to Rashkin Report. You're listening to WSUW 91.7 FM, The Edge in Whitewater, Wisconsin. This is Yuri Rashkin, and you're listening to Rashkin Report. I'm excited to welcome back to the program Slava Rabinovich, who are our on-site expert of all things Russian, speaking to us from Moscow, Russia. Slava, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Yuri. Glad to be back.
We have an exciting development. As everybody in the world, I think, knows by now, Donald Trump got elected to be president of the United States. Granted, it's not officially sealed by the Electoral College, but all signs point that Donald Trump is going to be the 45th president of the United States. I think just as many people as know about this many people are surprised by this development. But you seem rather optimistic about what this may mean for Russia and for the world. Can you elaborate on how you feel Trump administration is going to have, what the relationship is going to have with Putin and with Putin's Russia, and why you're optimistic?
Well, you're putting the word optimistic into a context should be really clarified what context it is. Whatever is good for Russia means, in my mind, being bad for Putin and vice versa. So unlike some of the Russian propaganda and various state functionaries who work for Putin, I do not associate Putin with Russia, and I do not subscribe to their statement that Putin is Russia and Russia is Putin. Therefore, the faster Putin goes, the better it will be for Russia and for the Russian people. It was a premise all along for so many months that in the Kremlin's mind, a possible election of Donald Trump would be good for Putin and for the Putin's regime. I was of a different view, and I am more so of a different view after Trump's unexpected victory. You can analyze this by actually looking at who is going to be in the U.S. presidential administration, who Trump is going to nominate for key posts in the government, who will be the Secretary of State, who will work as presidential advisors, and anywhere you look, you will see various names with a long track record of opposing Putin's regime one way or another. So all of this so-called optimism regarding Trump's election being favorable for Putin and his regime is just a bunch of BS that I don't think we should, waste too much time on discussing this. Kremlin is full of incompetent, stupid people. Not talking about their being criminals and murderers. So just the overall incompetence and inability to analyze pretty simple things is how the Kremlin operates.
All right. I should correct myself then. When you spoke, when I spoke of your optimism, I did take into consideration the adjustment for the fact that you are a strong critic of Putin's regime, and therefore, if you are optimistic about something, then that means that this is something that is not good for Putin's regime. And what we've heard is kind of a changing dynamic, but this is kind of not that unusual because everybody's in a little bit of a shock and trying to figure out what is going to happen next. There is word that maybe the policy towards Russia is going to remain not as friendly as Trump has indicated during his campaign, but might actually take a very harsh turn. And would you welcome that?
Well, in 1980, the Soviet Politburo were very happy and dancing and applauding and clapping hands for the fact that Ronald Reagan, a Republican candidate, defeated Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, and they thought that it's going to be very good for their regime and for the Soviet Union. Remember that they invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and Jimmy Carter banned U.S. sportsmen and the members of the Olympic team from going to Moscow, from participation in the Summer Olympics of 1980 in Moscow. And the Politburos were thinking to themselves, okay, this democratic President Carter is now gone. He was the one who created all this international boycott of our Olympic Games. Now we're going to have a different president in the U.S. who is going to cooperate with us. We all know what happened next. In 1987, Ronald Reagan had this historical speech at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, just next to Berlin Wall, where he said his historical words. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you really want what you say, a change, please come here to Berlin, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Just around this time, there were significant changes in the USSR taking place. In 2 years after this speech of Reagan in Berlin, the Berlin Wall came down, and only 2 years after that, the whole Soviet Union collapsed. And Politburo still was clapping hands in 1980. It is possible that I'm not saying something like that will happen now, but I'm just saying that these people are not smarter than the Politburo then. These people in the Kremlin, they're as stupid, and in fact, most of them are KGB officers of the Brezhnev's time. Putin and Patrushev and his comrades in arms from the KGB are all Brezhnev's low-ranking officers who studied in the higher KGB school in 1975. So what can you expect from these people?
So it sounds to me like you're expecting a more traditional Republican approach out of Trump administration. And, just to clarify, the other point that I think you does such an elaborate and good, great detailed job of, I haven't heard Ronald Reagan quoted quite this extensively from memory in the past. Usually people just remember tear down the wall, but you're right. There was a little bit more, like you said, it was very important. Do you feel that, Democrats seem to be not getting along well with Russian leadership historically because Democrats tend to be more concerned about human rights and those kinds of messy things that get in the way of KGB doing whatever they want to do. But at the same time, Republicans have a tendency to spend more money, and especially on the military-industrial complex, which needs to have some kind of target. And Russia is a it's a perfect target right now. So don't they understand this in Kremlin?
Yuri, sorry, you were breaking up at some points, but I think I heard your question. I think that on average, indeed, there were occasionally, on average, democratic administrations were not that cooperative with Russia, but this is not a rule of thumb over the long period of time. If you take it and analyze that, the relationship during the Clinton administration was quite good, and it mostly depends on the what's happening in Russia and in the Kremlin over medium to long term during those kind of periods. So I think that we should not emphasize in the analysis who is really in charge in Washington at the moment, whether Republicans or Democrats. I think that just Russia entered into a tailspin stage of the whole country development, where it will be axis of evil for any kind of administration in the U.S.
Now, Trump has said that he was looking forward to having friendlier relations with Russia, and a lot of Americans are looking at this and saying, well, what is so bad about being on friendly terms with anybody? That not necessarily is a perspective that I would suspect you subscribe to.
He said a lot of different things. He said many things. He also said, while being asked what he would do if Russian military planes would repeat such maneuvers over U.S. warships almost at a razor-thin distance from antennas and so on and so forth. And he said that he would have shot down that Russian plane. There is nothing bad about a good relationship between the U.S. and Russia in general. But in terms of what's happening in Russia and how Russia behaves in terms of its relationships around the world and what Russia does to various countries is going to be inconsistent with level of tolerance of any type of the U.S. administration. And in addition, I don't have to tell you or your listeners that, how Obama's administration was withdrawing the United States from almost all places of conflict around the world. This was a major withdrawal of the U.S. from just about everywhere. And in fact, we now all know that it became a very significant factor of destabilization around the globe, destabilization in various political systems around the world, destabilization caused by Russia and by similar rogue regimes. The world is changing rapidly because the Obama administration put brakes on the U.S. Status of being a world policeman. And I don't think that we can accuse future actions of President-elect Trump of pursuing the same kind of strategy in a much bigger way versus what Obama has already done. And I think that the future Trump administration will be of significantly different view on many issues around the globe, and in particular Russian aggression around its neighbors, and not only neighbors, as we know that Russia undertook serious attacks versus the United States in the cyber espionage and cybersecurity areas, trying to even kind of participate in such a weird way in U.S. Election process, which is completely unacceptable for the U.S. as the state. So I don't think that Trump is going to just sit back and enjoy the ride in the international politics like Obama was doing.
So you expect a more active foreign policy from the United States than perhaps the world has seen over the last 8 years, and you consider that to be a good development?
Yes, but it also may be in somewhat different manner. It could be that Trump will decrease somewhat the value of NATO being a world policeman, and increase the U.S. being a world policeman, unless and until he makes other countries to pay up in terms of their share of financing their NATO participation. But one way or another, even if policies are adjusted somehow in the view of Donald Trump, that the new policies should be more in the lie in the interest of the U.S., it doesn't mean that U.S. foreign policy will be as relaxed or even more relaxed as the Obama's one. So I think that he will be much more active. And again, just looking at who is going to be in Obama's administration, looking at all these candidates.
You mean Trump's administration?
Sorry, in Trump's administration.
Right.
It is just impossible to imagine that these people, separately and collectively, are not going to confront Putin's rogue regime.
Well, Slava, then perhaps last question on what we can expect from Trump administration in these early days following the election and relationship between the United States and Russia. How effective do you think this change in policy will be in at least containing, if not pushing back, the aggression that comes from Putin's regime currently?
It is extremely difficult to predict or draw any scenarios on the effectiveness and on timelines and so on, because there are so many moving parts in relation to the possible and potential longevity of the current Putin's regime. The Russian economy is really damaged, but it is damaged not only by sanctions, but it is more damaged by many other factors, and the biggest overriding one is that Putin destroyed capitalism in Russia, and he built a bandit neo-feudalism. The absence of capitalism and the current regime of neo-feudalism cannot support any type of economic activity or economic development. And the economy in Russia will be destroyed completely. We just don't know the timing and the exact scenario how this is going to unfold.
So regardless of American policy, Russia, as you said, has entered a tailspin, and it may not matter whether Trump is more active internationally than Obama was in accomplishing the goal of taking the Russian threat out of the world equation.
Yes, and again, I will repeat, there are so many moving parts. Even if the Russian economy in a tailspin and blowing up completely, or one day, or in a series of several blow-ups hitting a concrete wall, we just don't know what will happen next, because Putin also destroyed many other things. He destroyed a separation of power between the court system, the legislature, and the executive power. He destroyed all those branches of power altogether. He is not really a president, so the executive power is also destroyed. He's not really a president. He was not elected in a legitimate way. There is no legitimacy to his so-called third term, which is not allowed by the Constitution. He is violating Constitution, although he is a so-called guarantor of the Constitution, as it is written in the Constitution that the president should be a guarantor of the Constitution. He is a state an international criminal and a war criminal. So there is no presidency in Russia. And he also destroyed two other very important things. He destroyed the institution of free, fair, and democratic elections, and he destroyed the institution of change in the power, in the executive power, and any type of a political change in Russia. And because of all these factors, it is impossible to predict what would happen, because we just don't know how this can be changed. And even if the economy is completely destroyed and it hit the brick wall and blew up, and the banking system is not operating, a critical mass of a critical number of the Russian companies went bankrupt. People are out of job. They don't, there are not 20% of the Russian population living under the poverty line, but let's say 60%. We just don't know what the regime will do. It may well go into a complete overdrive in terms of the repression internally and in terms of the aggression externally. It may be very dangerous. We're living in the time when it has never happened in the history of mankind that this kind of mafia took over the state, and the state became the mafia. And in addition to that, this mafia state took possession of one of the two largest nuclear arsenals in the world. So we have no idea how it's going to unfold. But I don't think that the status quo in terms of how it looks like now, internally and externally, in terms of Russia, that this is going to be for much longer, because the economic very, very rapid deterioration is not going to let the status quo to continue for a very long time.
You're listening to WSUW 91.7 FM, The Edge in Whitewater, Wisconsin. This is Rashkin Report, and I'm your host, Yuri Rashkin. We are speaking with Slava Rabinovich, straight from Moscow, a very popular blogger with over 100,000 subscribers, a news analyst, a hedge fund manager, and a man of strong opinions. Slava, shifting the conversation to what's going on in Russia, it seems that in the last few days, really, it became clear that perhaps Mr. Putin isn't really running the country quite as much as we all maybe thought. It turns out that, the leader or the manager or CEO of the big oil company, Rosneft, if I'm not mistaken, Igor Sechin, is actually perhaps in charge of the country as he gets to determine who is going to be arrested and prosecuted, including most recently Putin's Secretary of Economic Development, who was just sacked. How much of a shock and what kind of repercussions can this development have on internal and external politics?
This indeed produced a pronounced shock among the so-called systemic liberals, but it's no shock to me. And also, in your words, Yuri, I hear some of the mainstream opinions that you obviously read in the press about it. And I am of a slightly different opinion. Sechin, the president of Rosneft, is not the most powerful man in Russia, as some now describe him, in terms of being even more important than Putin and being able to do what you just described he did. I think that if you look through two respective biographies of Putin and Sechin, going back 25 years, and consider that Putin was carrying a briefcase of former mayor of St. Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak, then Sechin at the same time was carrying the briefcase of Putin. And I don't think that these roles ever changed. Putin in charge Sechin in 2003 to destroy Yukos and put Khodorkovsky away in jail. And it was Putin's plan, which was executed and carried out by Sechin. As a reward, Sechin got Rosneft into in his hands, and Rosneft, as we know, was the biggest beneficiary of the criminal dismantling of Yukos. Shareholders of Yukos were all ripped off. The $40 billion of the entire market capitalization of Yukos evaporated via absolutely criminal court decisions. Yukos was bankrupted, and the most valuable pieces of Yukos were then laundered through a intermediary company called Baikal Finance Group into Rosneft. The existence of Baikal Finance Group and how it was used as an intermediary company, and who was the beneficiary of huge cash that accumulated after all these transactions, and where this cash went, we may someday find out when Putin is actually on a bench in court after his regime is gone and he is arrested and prosecuted. But that was Putin as a masterminder, as the mastermind of that, and Sechin was again executing the plan. And then Sechin got this job of being the president of Rosneft. He got $50 million, and again, I repeat it, 50, not 15, not 15, $50 million as an annual fixed salary, as an annual guaranteed salary in this position of the president of Rosneft. That was back in 2005, I believe. And now, more than 10 years later, he received $500 million in just guaranteed annual salary. And this is not talking about all this money that is being actually stolen from this company. Now, who is the beneficiary of how the money is being stolen and how the assets are accumulated in Rosneft? I don't think that Sechin is the main beneficiary. It's Putin, his boss. And the entire pre-story before the Minister of Economics was sacked and actually arrested, the entire prequel to that was the story of privatization, quote-unquote privatization, of another oil company which is called Bashneft, which is now being bought by Rosneft. And this is, again, a so-called privatization, quote-unquote, of a company by another state-owned company. This is so ridiculous that your listeners in America probably won't even understand what I'm talking about. But this is true. This is how the Putin-style privatization works. Bashneft was nationalized and was stolen from Mr. Yevtushenkov, who owns the company called Sistema. This is a London Stock Exchange listed company. The Bashneft was nationalized and taken away from Sistema, and after being nationalized in such a criminal way, it's being so-called privatized via a purchase by another state-owned company. And Economics Minister Lukayev was just too vocal in his criticism of one state-owned company buying another state-owned company and calling this privatization. But we all know why it's being done, how it is being done, who is going to be the beneficiary of this. And we all know, or not all, but I know that Putin is the principal and Sechin is just the executor of this, probably receiving some type of a so-called performance fee or a carried interest in these types of transactions, including this one. So when what you're saying, how this story was unfolding a couple of days ago, including the the use of security services in Russia and FSB and so on and so forth, and how Sechin organized this. Of course he organized this because Putin is the one who is the masterminder of this.
All right, Slava, then, I guess first I want to clarify for our listeners that the word neft that we keep hearing, Rosneft, Bashneft, neft means oil. So we have all these oil companies that are consuming and privatizing each other. And we've seen something similar after 2008 crash with banks, where money was given to banks in the United States and they used it to buy up each other. But here we have it on a much more criminal scheme level, where we have a number of criminal organizations that are basically absorbing each other as fast as they can because the amount of the economic pie continues to shrink. So do you look at this, Slava, and let's say Putin is indeed in charge as you claim, and I really have no reason to argue because you have a much better grasp on the situation than a lot of the people. Do you feel then we are looking at a new a regime of repressions where people are going to magically disappear in the middle of the night, like was happening in Stalin's time? Is this something that in Russia is called cleansing of elites? What is this? Just a constant redivision of the ever shrinking pie until somebody is, alone? Perhaps Mr. Sechin, perhaps somebody else remains the sole winner of the entire pie together with Mr. Putin, and then what?
I have no idea, Yuri, and neither do you or anybody else, because I just said that Putin destroyed all types of institutions, making Russia a state. Those institutions, as written in the Constitution, used to make Russia a state. Now it's not a state. It's just a banana republic with no bananas. It is a. It's not. You cannot even call it a rogue state. You can call it a mafia state with headed by war criminals, state criminals, murderers, thieves who took possession of nuclear weapons. And when you're asking whether people can disappear at night like in 1937, well, the Minister of Economics just disappeared at night until, and nobody knew his whereabouts until the investigative committee officially announced that he was arrested. And that happened in the middle of the night. And we all kind of tried to recollect when was the last time when the acting minister of the Russian or the Soviet government was arrested in his job. And we figured out, in fact, when it last happened. Do you, by the way, know the answer to this question?
I do not know the answer to this trivia, no.
1953, Beria, under Stalin.
So this is a chief of security or national security, however, or KGB under Stalin, who quite possibly is responsible for Stalin's death and was hoping to take over. Didn't happen, and he was sacked himself and executed almost immediately. And then since then, that was kind of the end of Stalin's times in some way.
Exactly.
And then after that, that's been 60 years of no ministers or secretaries of anything being arrested while still employed by the state.
That's correct.
Interesting.
This is an extraordinary event. I mean, many people do not realize.
Absolutely. Slava, I guess the last question or the area that I'd like to cover with you, in this conversation is we're speaking a lot about elites. We're speaking about Mr. Putin, Mr. Sechin, Secretary Ulukayev, all these exciting people that are, we read about in newspapers. But what about regular Russian people? How are they taking all of these developments, whether it's election of Trump, whether it's the economy that's falling apart, whether it's these mass, not quite mass, but still repressions against political opposition? How are people responding to this?
You see, people fell into a long-term trap of destruction of the Russian education system, of the complete brainwashing over television throughout the last 15 to 20 years. I'm not talking about the propaganda of the last 2.5 years. I'm talking about a complete deterioration of quality of the television programs over the last 15 years compared to what the television looked like in the 90s. Then a generation of people, and not even one generation of people, grew up not knowing any type of life without Putin. There are now people who are 20 years old and they do not remember anybody but Putin. And there are also people who are 10 years old and they live under Putin. The experiment that was undertaken 2.5 years ago on the state-owned Russian television, a completely criminal experiment of the Goebbels type of propaganda, finished off the majority of the Russian population, if we're talking about large numbers. If we're talking about the entire Russian population and the percentage of the Russian population who is really affected by this experiment.
How do people respond to the arrests?
So the arrests of whom? Of Ulukayev? Of the Russian economics minister?
Right. And in a sense that, are they saying that he stood in the way of this transaction? Are they saying that he did something to anger Putin? Because clearly Putin has to be the good guy.
No, but the arrest of Ulukayev was presented in a way that he was extorting a bribe from Sechin, from Rosneft, for his ministry, giving a favorable report to the government for this so-called privatization to go ahead. And it is presented that he was arrested while taking a bribe under the surveillance of the Russian security service, the FSB. And because he is considered to be one of the so-called systemic liberals, the people at large, going via the prism of the Russian television propaganda, they are just the opposite. They are saying, "Oh, Putin is great. He's fighting corruption, and nobody is invincible, even in the highest echelons of the government. Look at what happened. the minister got sacked and arrested. It's good. Putin is really fighting the corruption at last. And so it is this propaganda which works in both directions. One is that Putin is really fighting corruption, and on the other hand, those people in the government who are still considered to be so-called systemic liberals, their camp is being damaged and destroyed even further. So this is nothing but a complete surreal kind of oral type situation that is typical of everything anywhere you look, listen, or otherwise analyze in Russia. It is just a parallel world of you can't even describe it in quite simple terms. Really, it is really a parallel world where there is nothing but lies, not a single word of truth in these so-called official versions of anything.
Well, on that note, Slava Rabinovich, pleasure as always to have you on the program, and looking forward to speaking with you again. It's I think we want to be hopeful, but is it easy to be hopeful? I think it's a little bit difficult to be hopeful in this situation. I guess the best thing we can say is, like you said, we don't know what's going to happen. There's a lot of variables, and so perhaps that's the best part about it.
Well, you said it well.
Slava Rabinovich, thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you.
You're listening to 91.7 FM, WSUW, in Whitewater, Wisconsin. You're listening to Rashkin Report.